Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, guys, is multicellularity and specialization. Okay, specialization is the thing that essentially separates a multicellular organism from a group of single-celled organisms that are living in a group. All right, because there are some organisms that look like they're multicellular, but in actual fact, if you separated the cells, all of them would survive just fine. Okay, in a multicellular organism, there's something called specialization, which makes that essentially impossible. Okay, I couldn't, let's say, take the liver cells out of your body and say that they'll do fine without the other cells. They won't. Okay, there's this interdependency that goes on when you have cells that are specialized to do a certain job. Okay, so we're going to be looking at how those things differ. But we're going to spend the first, half to 2/3 of the class here talking about essentially how multicellular organisms evolved. We're going to talk about evolution. We're going to talk about a little bit about natural selection, and I'm going to talk to you about how creationism, okay, and the idea of evolution are not the mortal enemies everyone believes they have to be. Okay. Recently, even Pope Francis has talked about how science and religion can coexist and how these two ideas actually fit very nicely together, which is what all of us science teachers have been saying for years. But we're kind of going to go over that. So there is going to be a little bit of us talking a bit about what you might have learned in your religion class, which I don't get to do very often, which I enjoy doing. Okay, so we're going to be talking about that a little bit as well, and kind of comparing those two things, and so that you understand, I'm not teaching you something that's sacrilegious. Okay, that your religion teacher would come in here and beat on me for. Okay, so we'll kind of go over that as well. All right, so we got to look at how multicellularity evolved, look at the role of specialization in multicellularity. Okay, examine the plant as an example of a multicellular organism with specialized cells and tissues. Now, we've talked about these specialized cells and tissues already a little bit. Okay, we talked about the palisade cells and the spongy layer, and the guard cells and the stomate and all of that kind of stuff before Easter. Okay, we're just going to kind of review that. Those are examples of cells that do a certain job within the plant as a multicellular organism. Okay. Now, according to the Bible, what happened first? Okay, way before Adam and Eve. There was a lot of stuff that happened before them. They were the first people. Okay, let there be light, right? That was the first thing. Okay, I would have to think that the Big Bang was probably pretty bright. I'm just assuming. I wasn't there. Okay, but I'd have to assume the Big Bang was somewhat bright. Okay, we could look at let there be light in that way, or we could look at let there be light in the context of the development of our solar system. Okay, the first thing to form in our solar system was what? The sun. Yeah, okay. The sun formed before anything else. Okay, the cloud of gases and dust and whatever that was our solar system, let's say, 16 billion years ago, okay, was quite a bit different, okay, than what exists now. Right? And some of that stuff started to aggregate and collect, and the thing that was present most in this cloud of gas and dust is hydrogen. Hydrogen's the lightest and simplest of all the elements. So there was more of that than anything else, and it kind of all aggregated, or a lot of it aggregated in the middle. Okay? And as you get more and more of this stuff together, you get more and more mass. And what does mass make? The more mass you have, the more gravity you can exert. Okay, and so as this cloud of this bunch of hydrogen that was collecting in the middle got bigger and bigger and bigger, it also exerted more and more attractive force towards it. So it collected more hydrogen, more other particles, and eventually what happened was the hydrogen got condensed and crushed so much that it actually started forcing the nuclei of the atoms together. We talked a little bit about that in the chemistry unit. Okay, when that happens and it forces those nuclei together, what was that process called? When we force two atoms to become one. Nuclear fusion. Okay, and that's the process that powers the sun. When that happened, the sun became bright. Okay, it began to give off light, to give off heat, to give off energy, okay, and all those kinds of things. So we could say that that could also be explained by the let there be light, okay, idea. And then from there we have the separation of the heavens from the earth. Well, okay, we would certainly have the formation of the planets happening after that, which would be our Earth and the heavens around it. Okay, separation of the land from the sea. Okay, obviously the planet would have to cool a little bit after its formation process, and as the planet cooled, water would condense and fall on the surface to form the oceans and separate the land from the sea. Okay, and then there would be, that the seas would fill up with all manner of living things, and they would move on to land, which is all evidenced in the fossil record, okay, on Earth. So everything, okay, that God said happened did happen, and it happened in the same order. All right. The only thing that's different is the timeline. Okay, how long did it say in the Bible it took? Well, actually, it took 6 days. On the seventh day, he rested. That's the importance of the Sabbath. Okay, in kind of Hebrew type of religions. But yeah, it took 6 days. Okay, on the 6th day is when God created man, and that also fits because man is the last thing to essentially evolve and appear on Earth anyway. The idea here, though, is, and Pope Francis has said this, and many other religious figures. I remember a priest that I had in university. He explained this to me one time, and he said, "Look, you have to understand the time the Bible was written. Most people were illiterate; they couldn't have read it anyway. So what they had to do was explain things that were very complex in much more simple terms, and put them in time frames that people understood." Okay, if you'd have gone out in the time the Bible was written and said to people, over the course of 2 billion years, the following things happened, they would have thrown rocks at you until you were dead. Okay, that's called stoning. Right? They pile you up with rocks and they throw rocks at your head until you die. Okay, yeah, you would not have been well accepted in having said something like that. Okay, so instead, okay, you use an analogy. Okay, have you learned that term in English? An analogy, right? It's a comparison. So you say, the Earth was created on the first day. This happened. On the second day, this happened. Okay, and you put it in a time frame that people understood. A week was a sacred amount of time to people. Okay, and so it made sense to use that as a time frame for the creation of the Earth. It wasn't ever meant to be taken literally. Okay, it's figurative. All right, that time scale. No, I'm not saying that everything in the Bible is figurative. It's not. Okay, there's lots of stuff in the Bible that should be taken exactly as it is. Okay, but in this case, the analogy of the 6 days, okay, is just that. It's an analogy. Okay, it certainly took longer than that. God's a smart guy. Okay, he knows that not that if he wanted to do it in 6 days, he couldn't have. I'm not saying that either. Okay, but in order to sort of fit with everything, that's what we believe. Now, multicellularity would have evolved somewhere near the end, actually, of our time scale. All right, the Earth is between 4.5 and 5 billion years old. Okay, multicellular organisms have been around for less than a quarter. Let's say about a quarter of that. Okay, maybe a little more than a quarter. Okay, but certainly not long in the grand scheme. It took a long time to get the conditions to be right. Okay, so we're looking here kind of at a evolutionary family tree of multicellular organisms here. It uses a lot of terms that you guys are probably not familiar with, but essentially it shows how plants and other multicellular organisms have evolved, and how a lot of those things end up just going extinct. Okay, they disappear, they're not adapted, and they only appear as things in the fossil record. Now, a lot of this was discovered obviously more recently. Okay, and part of that is because the fossils that we have are microscopic. Okay, and until the technology came around where we could look at microscopic fossils or micropaleontology, a lot of this stuff was not confirmed. It was just an idea. Okay, but now that we've seen these microscopic fossils, it's been much easier to trace sort of the lineage of larger, more complex organisms. Okay, so here's kind of the 6-day analogy, but spread out with the actual timeline. Okay, 4.6 billion years ago, okay, the sun has already formed. The sun's been burning for a few billion years already. Okay, all the planets in our solar system formed by a similar process as the sun. Okay, things started to clump together because they were attracted to each other. Okay, and as those pieces that clumped together got bigger, they attracted more things to them. Okay, obviously the rocky inner planets attracted mostly dust and rock. Okay, reason for that? the sun is in the middle of the solar system and it had already taken all of the hydrogen. There wasn't a lot of that left. Okay, so other substances would have collected, which is why we have rocky inner planets. Okay, the gas giants and the ice giants out, further in the outer planets there, okay, would have collected more of the lighter gases that were available. And again, it's all a matter of these things coming together, getting heavier, generating more gravity and attracting more things to them. Okay, now that process is not calm. Okay, it involves the smashing together of things. Okay, especially when we're talking about the rocky inner planets. Okay, when you've got chunks of rock, okay, coming together, they don't just go, hey, and do this. Okay, they smash into one another, and when that happens, they get really hot and they essentially become molten. All right, and so they form this essentially molten ball. All right, so the Earth very early on in its history would have been essentially molten. All right, so 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth forms. Okay, and okay, that's because it was hit by countless meteorites. Okay, the crust eventually cools. Okay, oceans condense. Okay, but are too hot for life. Now, also around this time would have been the time the Moon formed. Anyone know how the Moon formed? Okay. For a long time, there were a lot of theories about that, but now there's one. Okay, one that is generally confirmed. The Moon was actually part of the Earth. Okay, and it was formed because another body formed within the Earth's orbital path. And at some point, 4.5 billion years ago or so, they smashed into one another. Okay, and that caused the, okay, it wasn't like a direct head-on collision, it was kind of a glancing blow, but it was enough, okay, that both parts became molten, and the debris that was shot out essentially coalesced and became the Moon, and the other thing essentially became part of the Earth. All right, so we had the Earth was about the size it is now, but the impact threw off a fair amount of mass, but it also absorbed a fair amount of mass from the impacting object. Okay, and so the Moon, okay, has formed around the Earth. Now, when it first formed, it was also a lot closer to the Earth. Okay, because it was formed from this impact. The Moon is actually getting further away from the Earth all the time, by about a few centimeters a year. This far. Okay, how do they know that? They have like a measuring tape. Go out there and see. Okay, well, what they have is, because we've landed on the Moon, they placed mirrors on the Moon. Okay, and they bounce lasers off those moons, and they time how long it takes the laser to come back. Okay, and it takes a little bit longer. Okay, a few thousandths of a second every year, okay, for that light to go to the Moon and back. Okay, meaning the Moon's getting a little bit further away all the time. Now, how do they know the Moon came from the Earth? Well, because we landed on the Moon and we brought back what? Rocks. Yeah, we brought back a whole bunch of moon rocks. What are they made of? The same stuff as the Earth. Okay, only way that could be possible is if one came from the other. Okay, so the stuff that the Moon is made out of is essentially the same stuff that the surface of the Earth is made out of. The Moon is actually really light for its size. Okay, that means it didn't form by the same process as the Earth. Okay, because if it did, it would be a lot heavier. It would have the same kind of iron core that's very heavy that makes Earth heavy. Okay, it's only made out of the stuff that the surface of the Earth is made out of. So for its size, it's actually quite light. Okay, as the Earth cools after all this getting smacked around happens, okay, the oceans condense, okay, and 3.9 to 3.5 billion years ago, life originates as single-celled organisms. Okay, the atmosphere is a lot different at this time, though. Okay, the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, ammonia, nitrogen, okay, things like that. There's virtually no oxygen in it. So the only types of organisms that could survive then are ones that could use carbon dioxide and make their own oxygen. Meaning, what kind of organisms? What mode of nutrition? Yeah, they would have to be photosynthetic. They'd have to be photoautotrophs, okay, because they can use carbon dioxide, they can make their own oxygen to burn the sugar they produce. Okay, those would have been our blue-green algae, extremely small, prokaryotic, simple cells. Okay, so life all still in the ocean because the atmosphere is still relatively toxic. Okay, 2.8 to 2.5 billion years ago, photosynthesizing bacteria have been carrying on in the ocean for over 1 billion years. Do you suppose they could make a fair amount of oxygen in that time? Yeah, especially since really there's nothing out there to use it either. It builds up pretty quick when there's no animals out there to breathe it in and use it up. So at this point, the Earth changes radically. Okay, it reaches kind of a tipping point. The level of oxygen in the atmosphere is building up. The level of carbon dioxide is going down. The ammonia and stuff like that has almost essentially disappeared. And at that point, the Earth undergoes what we call the first mass extinction. Okay, what's a mass extinction? A big extinction. So like a significant percentage of all life on Earth dies. Okay? The reason it died was because it was adapted to a certain composition of gases. And the photosynthetic organisms had been changing that for 1.5 billion years. Okay? And so a lot of organisms simply died off. The atmosphere reached a tipping point where it became toxic for them and they died. Okay? And the only things that remained were things that could use oxygen, okay, and also still carry out photosynthesis. Okay. Now, we start to see bacteria at this point becoming a little bit more complex. Okay, so we're probably starting to see at this point some bacteria that are chemoheterotrophs. Okay, they're able to consume the large amounts of photosynthetic organisms that are hanging around. If you could do that, would you be reasonably successful? Because you'd essentially be the only predator, and there'd be nothing but prey for you everywhere. Now, it's hard to imagine a bacteria being a predator, okay? But really, if you're consuming any other form of life, okay, you're a predator, and there would be a lot of prey out there for you. Now, about another 500 million years later, okay, oxygen's continuing to build. Large single-celled organisms appear. Okay, these large single-celled organisms would be the first eukaryotic organisms. Okay, so now we're starting to see cells that have a nucleus, have mitochondria, okay, things like that, different than the prokaryotic organisms that have been living. Now, does that present an advantage? For certain, yeah. Being bigger and being more complex in your cellular structure is going to make you probably a bit more adaptable, okay? And obviously being bigger in that time would also be better because you'd have a larger selection of prey items and things like that, okay? Multicelled life originates, okay? So multicellular organisms have been on Earth for less than half of the Earth's history, okay? What's the advantage of being multicellular? Can you be big? Yeah, okay. Being multicellular overcame the surface area to volume ratio problem we talked about before Easter. Okay, all your cells have the right surface area to volume ratio, but because you have lots of them, you can get big. The other advantage is that as multicellular organisms evolved, some of their cells became specialized. That is, some of their cells changed and they performed a certain task, and other ones performed a different task. Okay, that meant that probably there were some tasks that those cells now didn't do, or didn't do as well, but there were other cells that were specialized to do those jobs, and because they're connected, they can pool their resources. All right, that's going to make them more efficient. All right, rather than having a cell that is a generalist, okay, and having to do everything, right, and be a jack of all trades but a master of none. Okay, you can now have an organism that contains a bunch of masters of certain trades, okay, all working together. You guys follow me there? Okay, it would be like if I had to teach you all of the classes that you took. Okay, my specialty is science, especially physics. Okay, my specialty is not English or social studies. Okay, if I had to teach you that, I would not do as good a job of it, okay, as your English teacher does, because they're a specialist in English. Okay, but we work together in this whole school as an analogy, okay, to make your educational experience better. Right? It would make no sense at all for having me teach you English, all right, because I just wouldn't do as good a job. Everyone follow there? All right. Now, once multicellular organisms evolved, things really take off. This diagram here, you see how this blue line here gets thicker and thicker and thicker as we go? Okay, the blue line represents the diversity of life on Earth. Okay, and diversity means how many different kinds of things there are. So very early on, there's essentially no diversity. Okay, there's a few different types of organisms living on Earth, and that's it. But once multicellular life evolves, okay, you can see that line starts to really widen. Okay, and that's because being multicellular allowed not only cells to specialize, but organisms to specialize and start filling niches and having food chains develop and things like that. Okay, and as a result, okay, we had what's called, okay, the Precambrian-Cambrian explosion. Okay, there was this giant explosion of diversity of life. Okay, because true animals evolved. Okay, and as a result, filled in all these niches and things really just took off from there. Okay, now still on this diagram. Okay, and we're looking here at, you know, a billion years ago. Okay, this is 540 million years ago. Where is all this life? Still where? In the ocean. All right, life on land, okay, is fairly recent. All right, life on land. What was the first thing to come onto land? Plants or animals? Had to be plants. If an animal came onto land, what would they have eaten if there were no plants there? Okay, well, possibly each other. Okay, but again, you got to remember that the things that were living animal-wise were basically the most complex thing were fishes, right, in the ocean. Okay, there were no mammals or anything like that, just fish. All right, so 540 million years ago, the only life that's on land is plants. Okay, and they're big, like fern-looking things. Okay, and then shortly after that, so let's say about, you know, 300 million years ago or so, the first animals start moving on to land, amphibians mostly, then reptiles, and okay, later on mammals. So it's certainly a slow process, and part of the reason it's slow is that along the way, things happen to the Earth and knock it back, take it down a peg. Okay, there were a lot of extinction events along the way here. Okay, there was actually one right before this Precambrian explosion. Okay, that there was a mass extinction there as well. Okay, recent evidence says that that's actually possibly caused by a nearby supernova. Okay, so when a giant star collapses and then explodes, okay, it releases a lot of radiation. Okay, the idea here is that the Earth was possibly caught, okay, in the radiation of that explosion, and that killed off a lot of life. But that would also have meant a lot of mutations in the organisms that survived, and that could have led to, okay, this explosion of diversity, okay, that we see. Everyone following sort of how that worked? Okay, obviously it took longer than 6 days. 6 days was an analogy. Okay, it took billions of years for all this to happen. Man's obviously not on this picture. All right, humans have been on Earth for a very short period of time. Okay, if we represented the history of the Earth with a 24-hour clock, man would have appeared on Earth at 11:59.99. Okay, or 11:59:59.99. Okay, p.m. All right. Because we're looking at really, realistically, mankind has been on Earth 30,000 years, maybe less. Okay, everybody with me there? Homo sapiens, that's us. Okay, certainly 20,000 or less. All right, so being multicellular, okay, is pretty cool. It allows us to have a lot of advantages, overcome the surface area to volume ratio problem, okay, have specialized cells that do certain jobs and do them more efficiently than others, okay, and that's, of course, is what's led to, okay, Earth being so, filled with life. Yeah. Okay, so what distinguishes a multicellular organism from a colony of cells is the division of labor among cells differing in structure and function. That's specialization in a nutshell. Okay, this organism here, would that be a colony of cells or would it be a true multicellular organism? It's a colony. All the cells look alike. Okay, and realistically, if I took any one of those cells off, it would probably survive on its own. Okay, each one of them has, this flagellum here that would probably wave back and forth and create a flow of water, and any food particles in that water would be trapped here by these collars, okay, and then absorbed by the cell. Okay, they could maybe share the nutrition between each other if one was catching more food than the others, but realistically, each one of them would probably survive on its own. Okay. The idea here is that specialization may have actually evolved as a matter of one of these cells becoming injured, okay, and losing the ability to do one thing, but had the ability to do something else. And okay, the big step really was having the cells reproduce as a group, as opposed to each cell divides and reproduces on its own. Okay, that was kind of the big step towards being a true multicellular organism. You have specialization and you reproduce as a group, okay, instead of each cell reproducing on its own. Okay, so the evolution involved increasing cellular specialization. So as certain cells within the organism got better at doing one thing, okay, other cells would do other jobs and so on. Now, these are all kind of artists' impressions of early Earth, okay? And what do you notice about the moon in both of those pictures? Yeah, it's big because it's way closer, okay? And as we said, that's because of the way the moon formed. Now, the importance of that is that a lot of life, okay, needed to form in kind of tidal pools, okay, where there would be water part of the day and then the water would recede for part of the day, okay, and that's where we see these things here, okay, which are called stratoliths, okay. They're essentially big algae mats, okay, that had some organisms and things in it, okay. They were very, very common. About 600 or 700 million years ago. Okay, they were very, very common, and they formed these tidal pools. Now, what causes the tides? The moon. Now, if the moon was a lot closer to the Earth, okay, here's the effects of that. It doesn't take as long for it to go around the Earth. All right. In fact, very early on, it may have gone around the Earth even faster than the Earth turned on its own axis. Okay. Around this time, it probably took about a week. Okay, for the moon to go around once. All right, so tides, high tide and low tide, would happen more often. Okay, also the tides would be a lot greater. All right, it would be like everywhere on Earth would be like the Bay of Fundy. All right, how many people have ever been to Nova Scotia, been to the Bay of Fundy? Okay, you've seen it in your textbooks in science because there's always pictures of it where you've got this boat sitting on the water and there's another picture of the same boat sitting on the ground. Okay, because the tide has receded. Okay. In the Bay of Fundy, tides can change by a height of like 20 feet, okay, and they can recede a distance of several kilometers. Right? I know I've been out there a couple of times, and one time I decided I was going to follow the tide. Okay, so I took off my shoes and I just started walking and following the water as it went out, which seemed like a really good idea at the time. Okay, but it's really muddy, obviously. Okay, as the tide goes out, and then I started realizing that the water was coming back. And that was a problem because in that tidal mud you don't walk very fast. And I had walked out about 2 kilometers away from the cabin I was staying at, and the water started coming back in. And it comes in pretty quickly, okay, when it decides to come back in. And I thought for sure I was going to be swimming the last like 300 meters or so, okay, but it ended up that I was actually able to get there just ahead of the tide water. It comes in and it goes out really fast, okay, because there's there's 2 high tides and 2 low tides, okay, every single day. All right, so yeah, it's if the moon was a lot closer, the tides would have been a lot greater. So these areas of flood and then release would have been a lot bigger everywhere on Earth. All right? So things like that could have led to or helped this situation out. Because every time the tide comes in, it brings in food. Right? Brings in food for those organisms. All right. Now, we're going to look at cells within the plants that are specialized to do certain jobs. Okay, I'm not going to ask you about the names of these cells, so you're not going to have to remember what a parenchyma cell is because I'm never going to ask you that. Okay, but it's an example of a cell type within the plant. And oddly enough, it isn't specialized. Okay, parenchyma cells are what we call stem cells. They can become anything. Right? So if the cell needs to grow leaf tissue, these can become palisade cells, they can become spongy layer cells, they can become guard cells, okay, whatever they need. So they're generally concentrated within the buds of the plant. All right? So if you were looking at a bud of a plant, in there would be a lot of parenchyma cells that could essentially become whatever tissue the plant needs. All right? You'll also find a lot of parenchyma cells at the tips of the roots. Okay, because they can become more root tissue as the plant grows. All right, and usually buds are green in color, so they have lots of chloroplasts in them, okay, to help carry out photosynthesis to provide the energy. Okay, water conducting cells, okay, and the cells of the phloem, okay, they're much different than let's say palisade cells or spongy layer cells. They have to have a certain shape so that they fit tightly together so water can't leak out. Okay, or the sap can't leak out if it's a phloem cell. So they have a very unique shape. They also have a lot fewer chloroplasts because that's not really what, photosynthesis is not really what they do. Okay, they also have the ability to produce more lignin, okay, and cellulose fiber and things that are supportive, okay, than other parts of the plant. So they look quite a bit different in terms of their structure. Okay. So are we seeing here that we're seeing the difference in structure here? Okay, that's because of specialization. They have to do a different job, so they look a lot different. Okay, food conducting cells. Okay, so these are the phloem cells, and you can see that there's special tubes that actually run through. Okay, called a sieve tube. Right, and that helps to sort of have the sap move, but also provide a little bit of let's say like airflow, preventing bubbles and stuff like that. These are those sieve plates we talked about. Okay, right here, those ones that if a crystal starts to form, it hits this essentially screen, okay, and the weight of the sap above will crush it, okay, so that it doesn't get big enough to block the phloem tubes, okay, things like that. Again, they're microscopic, but they have a lot different structure than, let's say, a cell in the root, okay, or a cell in the leaf, because they're doing different jobs. Okay. All right, structure of the leaf. Did I say that this was important? Structure of the leaf, because we've talked about it, and this is about now the third time, okay, that we've gone over the structure of the leaf. So, yes, the layers of the leaf and what they do is definitely going to be something I would put on a test. All right. On the top, we've got the upper epidermis, those cells that secrete this. Okay, they secrete that waxy cuticle. What's the job of the waxy cuticle? Right, prevents water from evaporating from the entire surface of the leaf. Right, so your epidermal cells are specialized to produce that and not have a lot of other material in them because we don't want them to block the light that's trying to get to this layer here. Okay, because this is the palisade layer where all of the photosynthesis takes place. So your epidermal cells are actually quite transparent. Right? They don't have a lot of chloroplasts in them because their job is not to carry out photosynthesis. Their job is to secrete the waxy cuticle. Okay, underneath we have the cells that carry out photosynthesis. Okay, they're very sort of rigidly shaped. They all have a similar shape, and they're packed in very, very tightly so that as much surface area as possible is being used on the upper side of the leaf for photosynthesis, because obviously that's where the light comes in. Okay, we have inside of the leaf, we have the veins, okay, and the veins contain phloem, that's the red, okay, these red tubes here, the phloem, which is the living cells, okay, and then the xylem, which is the dead phloem cells, okay, that the water can transport through. Obviously, those have special structures for having the polar nature of water work, okay, within them, having a certain size, so all of that works. Okay, so all of that stuff is, okay, super important in terms of they're specialized to do this job. Their shape is a certain way. They don't have a lot of chloroplasts. Okay, underneath the palisade layer, okay, and where we find the veins is the spongy layer. Okay, spongy layer cells have chloroplasts because certainly they encounter some light and they can carry out some photosynthesis. Okay, but we don't see them packed nearly as tightly as the cells in the palisade layer. Okay, so it's not that these cells are really specialized to have a different shape, but the fact that they're not tightly packed leaves spaces in between where carbon dioxide and oxygen and water can move. Okay, carbon dioxide obviously diffuses this way, okay, through the spongy layer and into the palisade layer, whereas the oxygen produced by photosynthesis diffuses this way. All right, because it's always moving from high concentration to low concentration, and it would go out through the stomates, where carbon dioxide would go in through the stomates. Water vapor goes out through the stomates, okay, and creates that pulling force. Other specialized cells within the leaf are those guard cells that make up the stomate. Right, and those guard cells are specialized in that they can change their shape as their water vacuoles empty. Okay, so as photosynthesis takes place and the water vacuoles empty out, the guard cells change shape, and what do they do to the stomates then? Open them or close them? Close them, right. Okay, as their water vacuoles empty, the stomates close off, the plant stops carrying out photosynthesis, evaporation stops, and the plant conserves some water, right? And we looked at this. This is what we looked at under the microscope when we did the cell anatomy lab. Okay, we saw the palisade layer. Okay, so you can see that right here. Okay, there's the palisade layer with all of those rectangular shaped plant cells. Here's your upper epidermis, right? And you can see that the cells are not as dark, okay, as the cells below. They're just secreting the waxy cuticle. You can see the spongy layer down here. Okay, the cells are a lot more randomly shaped. Okay, you can see here there's a stomate right there. Okay, so you can see that the shape of the cells is different, but you see no stomates essentially on the top layer. Okay, why would there be no stomates on the top layer? What's the advantage of having those specialized cells only on the bottom? Okay, diffuses down partly. Will evaporation be faster in the sun or in the shade? In the sun. Where are the stomates always if they're on the bottom of the leaf? In the shade. Okay, that again helps to limit the amount of evaporation that occurs, okay, because they're always on the shady side of the leaf. All right. So, okay, the notes that are here, okay, basically are just telling you these are the functions of the different cells. So, yeah, I'll definitely ask about palisade layer, spongy layer. Okay, I'm going to ask you about those guard cells because we're going to go over those here in just a minute. Okay. So substances enter and leave the leaf by two different routes, veins and stomates. Okay, veins can bring in the water and the nutrients. They can also take out the sugar. Okay, and then carbon dioxide, oxygen move through the stomates. All right, so stomates look essentially like this. Okay, under a microscope, okay, this is what they look like. So you can see that the stomate is essentially a set of 4 cells, these small kind of generalized plant cells here on the side. Okay, so this one and this one, right? And then these red ones are the guard cells, right? And they can change their shape, okay, very easily based on the turgor pressure inside the water vacuole. So when the water vacuoles are full, they create pressure that makes the guard cells shaped like a bean. Okay, and so then there's a gap in between that water can go in and out of, carbon dioxide and oxygen can go in and out of. Okay, when you look at it from the side, this is what you see. Okay, there's a gap between, and that's where the water and stuff can go. When the water vacuoles begin to empty, the cells aren't as rigid and they close off, okay, that hole, and then they look like this from the side. Now there's no evaporation and there's no loss of carbon dioxide and oxygen either. Okay, and this is all because of osmosis. Okay, as water begins to evaporate through the leaf. Okay, so if we go back to here, as water evaporates from the leaf, okay, it's leaving behind salt in the spongy layer. Okay, and if the ability of the plant to bring water to the leaf is not sufficient, okay, so it's falling behind, salt begins to build up here. That means that the salt will start to draw water out of all the nearby cells, including the guard cells. So salt draws water out of these guard cells and into the spongy layer, and that closes the stomate. Okay, because now those guard cells don't have that rigid bean shape anymore, and the stomate closes off. Right. So everything that the plant does in terms of movement of water and controlling the rate of photosynthesis is all influenced by osmosis. Right? So plants essentially, multicellular plants evolved around that process. I can't remember never asking about this. Okay? I have always asked about how a plant regulates its water loss. Okay? So plants regulate water loss by having a waxy cuticle and through the stomates, okay, the process of osmosis, etc. All right, I want you guys to answer those questions, okay, and I'm meaning for each one of these a few sentences, okay, trying to kind of critical thinking skills here, give me a good, few sentence answer for each one, and then we'll go over them together here in a couple of minutes. All right, let's have a look at these questions here. So the first question, Why was multicellularity so superior to unicellularity? Okay, that is single-celled organisms. Okay, what competitive advantages did it serve? Okay, we've already said a couple of times that the big advantage of being multicellular, okay, over being single-celled is you overcome what problem? Okay, size. The surface area to volume problem. You can become big without having to deal with the problems of diffusion being slow over large distances. Okay, so that's the biggest one, is that it overcame the surface area to volume ratio, allowed organisms to become bigger, which gave them a competitive advantage. Okay, the second advantage is that if you have cells that are specialized to do something, they're doing it better than a single-celled organism that has to be a generalist and do all of the jobs, okay, equally well. So there's this efficiency that comes as part of being specialized, and there's the size thing where you can overcome the surface area to volume problem. Those are the reasons why multicellular organisms have been so successful. Okay, now, does that mean that there are not situations where single-celled organisms do better? Well, there are lots of situations where only single-celled organisms will survive in an area. Okay, some prokaryotic organisms, okay, have adapted to live in places that would kill almost instantly, right? A multicellular organism or a eukaryotic organism, right? And I'm thinking of the bacteria that they found living in the geysers and hot springs in Yellowstone National Park, where the temperature of the water is boiling. Okay, that the ones that live in deep sea vents that are completely absent from sunlight, okay, and they're around these volcanic vents and smokers and things like that that are always going off, that no eukaryotic cell or multicellular organism could inhabit. All right, so there are certainly places for those. Second question: how are the cells of the leaf different from cells found in the stem of a plant? What's the stem have to do? It's got to transport material, and it's got to support the foliage, the leaves. Okay? Does it carry out much photosynthesis? It did mean it carries out some, but not a lot. So it's specialized to do a different job. As a result, it also secretes more of the lignin. Okay, the cell walls are stronger. Okay, the shape of the cells is different. Cells in a leaf are specialized more for carrying out photosynthesis, so they don't have to be as strong. Okay, they can have more chloroplasts. All right, and that's because they have different jobs. Okay, describe how the epidermis and the stomates have similar jobs. Okay, they have similar jobs in that they both have to control what? Water, right? Specifically, how much of it evaporates. Right? Now, the epidermis doesn't really control that. It mostly just prevents it. It's a layer of wax that covers the entire leaf. The stomates are more in the controlling business. They can open and close based on the osmotic pressure created by salts present in the spongy layer, okay, and that can help to control the flow of water out of the stomates, okay, especially under, let's say, hot conditions. Okay, and then how the stomate works, okay, in there, and like I said, I can't remember a time where I didn't ask how a stomate worked on a test. You need to describe that process of osmosis that brings water up the stem, okay, and how that is going to cause more salt to be present in the spongy layer, and how that salt by osmosis is going to draw water, okay, out of the guard cells, and how that's going to change their shape and close the stomate. Okay, that process would need to be explained, okay, by you. Imagine that's a 4 or a 5 mark question. Okay, how much detail are you going to need there? Right. All right, questions on any of those? All right, so we've got about 15 minutes or so here left in class, so I'm just going to grab the Chromebooks here, and you have a little bit of time to work on some of those things that are coming up due for you here in the next little while.